The biased judge sided with Whoopi Goldberg, crushed Jasmine Crockett, and fined her $1,000, all within the first 9 minutes of the trial. But what he didn't know was that she had come prepared, with a secret recording, Supreme Court precedents, and a legal strategy so sharp it could turn the entire courtroom on its head. What did Jasmine reveal that forced the judge to back down and left Whoopi completely stunned? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett had faced angry governors, televised ambushes, and backroom threats before, but this morning felt different. The hallway outside her apartment was quiet, but the world beyond was boiling. Her phone buzzed nonstop with reporters, allies, and enemies. At 7:12 a.m., she zipped up her navy blue suit, clipped her congressional pin, and stared into the bathroom mirror for a full 5 seconds. "Let them come," she muttered under her breath. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I won't walk away from it either." At 9 a.m., she stepped out of the black sedan and walked into the federal courthouse in D.C., surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting journalists. Behind her, staffers tried to shield her from the chaos, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She moved with the calm intensity of someone who knew what was at stake. "Congresswoman Crockett, are you going to apologize to Whoopi Goldberg?" one reporter yelled. Jasmine didn't break stride. "Not when I haven't done a damn thing wrong," she said flatly. The answer echoed through the marble halls. The lawsuit was everywhere. CNN, Fox News, Twitter, Instagram. Whoopi Goldberg was suing Jasmine Crockett for $10 million, accusing her of defamation. The claim? That Jasmine's comments during a press conference, where she criticized daytime talk shows for selling narratives instead of truth, had specifically targeted The View and damaged its reputation. Goldberg's legal team said advertisers pulled out, ratings dipped, and her name was dragged through the mud. But Jasmine never mentioned Whoopi by name. The press called it a celebrity versus congresswoman showdown. But Jasmine knew it was bigger than that. This wasn't just about one sentence at a microphone. It was about whether an elected official could still tell the truth in public without being financially destroyed for it. It was about whether public discourse had become so fragile that any sharp criticism could be twisted into a lawsuit. And it was about whether a black woman, bold, unapologetic, and unfiltered, had any room left to speak truth to power in a system designed to shut her up. Jasmine had practiced law before Congress. She'd represented people who had nothing but the truth in their pockets and a system stacked against them. Now the tables had turned, and she was the one on the stand. The courtroom wasn't just a place of justice anymore. It was a battlefield, and she knew the terrain would be brutal. An aging judge with a history of bias, a celebrity plaintiff with media power, and a legal system too often tilted against people who look and sound like her. As she sat in the waiting room, flipping through her case file, one of her aides whispered nervously, "You don't have to do this alone, Jasmine. We can settle. No one would blame you." Jasmine closed the folder, looked up, and smiled, calm but steel-eyed. "If I settle, they'll think I was wrong. And worse, they'll think I was scared." She stood, straightened her blazer, and exhaled once. "Let's go remind them who I am." And with that, she pushed open the courtroom door, walking straight into the fire. She didn't fear the courtroom, but the moment she saw who was wearing the robe, her heart didn't skip a beat. It clenched. Judge Richard Monroe. The name alone carried a weight in Washington legal circles. Old money, older thinking, and a documented pattern of rulings that almost always swung against the underdog. He wasn't loud about his bias. He didn't have to be. His dismissals, his interruptions, his tone, they all told the story. And now in this nationally watched defamation case, it was Monroe who would decide whether Jasmine Crockett's voice deserved protection or punishment. He didn't wait long to show his cards. Jasmine hadn't finished her second sentence before Monroe leaned forward and cut her off. "We're not here for a speech, Congresswoman. Get to the point." The courtroom froze. Jasmine glanced at the clock. 31 seconds. That's how long she had been allowed to speak uninterrupted. She took a breath, tried again, but when she brought up a timeline of events leading to the press conference, he interrupted again, this time with a scoff. "Let's not pretend this is your courtroom, Congresswoman. Respect the bench. There was a flicker, just for a second, in her eyes, not fear, recognition. She had dealt with men like this her entire career. The type who confuse titles for truth. The type who fear what they can't control. She answered calmly but firmly, "I'm here to respect the law, Your Honor." Not your attitude. Her voice was measured, but the impact hit like thunder. Monroe's expression hardened. His hand moved without hesitation, grabbing the gavel. "You are fined $1,000 for contempt," he barked, striking the bench sharply. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. "Next time, try to bring some professionalism instead of passion." The courtroom didn't breathe. No one dared. A punishment in open court. Fast, humiliating, unprovoked. It wasn't about order. It was about dominance. Jasmine said nothing. Her hands stayed still. Her face didn't flinch. But inside, the signal was clear. This wasn't a hearing. It was a setup. The referee had picked a side before the match even started. And just when the weight of Monroe's bias settled over the room like a storm cloud, Whoopi's legal team struck, with numbers, headlines, and a narrative designed to bury Jasmine alive. The lead attorney walked to the center of the courtroom like a man about to pull the trigger. He held a binder, thick with printed evidence, and his eyes scanned the room like a hawk circling prey. "Your Honor, let's talk impact," he said smoothly, then flipped to the first exhibit. "Since the date of Congresswoman Crockett's remarks, The View has suffered a documented 17% drop in ratings during Q2. That's the steepest decline in 4 years." A gasp, barely audible, rippled through the back row. The number landed like a blow. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly, showing the first spark of interest since the hearing began. Jasmine didn't blink. The attorney let the tension hang for just a beat longer before continuing, his tone sharpening. "That kind of collapse doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone with a microphone decides to weaponize it." He didn't need to say her name. His eyes did. He moved closer to the bench, pulling out a set of corporate documents and laying them down with surgical precision. Two major advertisers, Lumiskin and Everclear Travel, terminated their sponsorships within 48 hours of her press conference. His voice dropped an octave. One of them wrote, and I quote, "We do not want our brand associated with public attacks on respected Black women in media." The courtroom froze. That line was chosen to sting, and it did. Then came the flood. With a single click of the remote, the projector screen behind him lit up with a wall of tweets, dozens of screenshots, comment threads, retweets, outrage. "We've documented over 1,200 unique tweets linking Congresswoman Crockett's remarks to public outrage against Ms. Goldberg and The View," the attorney said, gesturing to the screen. "This wasn't a ripple, it was a storm, and she started it. The tweets were brutal, some were angry, others scathing, many personal. They called Jasmine reckless, toxic, bitter, unfit for office. Some even accused her of using her platform to sabotage another Black woman's career." Faces in the courtroom shifted. Murmurs grew. The evidence wasn't just numbers now. It had emotion, momentum, and public anger wrapped around it. Monroe watched it all unfold, his eyes fixed on the wall like he was watching the verdict form itself in real time. Jasmine stayed still. She said nothing. But inside, the truth burned hotter than ever. They weren't here to prove defamation. They were here to turn outrage into law and make her its first example. And Jasmine had no intention of staying silent. The moment she began to speak, Judge Monroe leaned back and said coldly, "This courtroom isn't here to entertain speeches, Congresswoman. It's here to control them." The message landed like a slap in front of the entire room. Jasmine froze for a half second, then locked eyes with the bench. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The tension spoke louder than words. She turned to her binder, ready to lay out the legal foundation of her defense. But the moment she opened her mouth, Monroe cut her off again. "Counselor, we've heard enough theory." His tone was dismissive, almost bored. Jasmine tried to clarify. "Your Honor, this legal foundation is crucial to—" Bang! The gavel came down hard. "We're not here for a lecture." Jasmine changed tactics. She moved to explain the timeline of events that led to the press conference. But before she finished her second sentence, Monroe waved his hand. "Irrelevant. Move on." His words were calm, but the damage was loud. He wasn't listening to what she said. He was waiting for an excuse to shut her down. She stayed steady, but her grip on the podium tightened. She tried again, citing a different angle of the case. Too vague, Monroe said. Another attempt. Off topic. Then with a touch of mock concern, he added, Counselor, please control your tone. Her tone had been respectful, measured, but none of it mattered. He wasn't judging her argument. He was judging her presence. Around the room, the imbalance was no longer subtle. It was glaring. The prosecution had spoken without interruption. Jasmine, by contrast, was being cut off every 30 seconds. Her defense wasn't being heard. It was being strangled. And everyone in that courtroom knew it, even if they didn't dare say it out loud. The law hadn't failed her yet, but the man wielding it already had. And while Monroe tried to clip her voice down to fragments, Jasmine did something he didn't expect. She raised it, not with shouting, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous inside a courtroom built on control. Composure sharpened to a blade. She took one deliberate step forward, shoulders squared, and let her voice break through the silence like it belonged there. Because it did. Since I'm not being allowed to present my case through proper channels, she said, eyes locked on the bench, I will speak for myself, and I will speak loudly enough for the record to hear me. The courtroom shifted. Even Monroe, rigid and rehearsed, looked briefly unsettled. Jasmine didn't wait for him to regain control. She seized it. I am exercising my constitutional right to self-representation, she declared, voice echoing off marble and ego. This is not theater. This is law. And I came prepared. Her tone wasn't just confident, it was courtroom steel. Everyone could feel the temperature change. The gallery leaned forward. The tension pivoted. For the first time, Jasmine wasn't on the defensive. She was delivering opening fire. She opened her binder with precision, then raised her head and delivered her first strike. New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964. That's the precedent that protects public figures from defamation claims. Unless there is proof of actual malice. Your Honor, there is none here. Not even close. Her delivery was measured, her gaze direct. The phrase, actual malice, landed like a legal grenade in the middle of Monroe's smug quiet. She turned the page. The courtroom didn't breathe. Falwell versus Flint, 1988. The court ruled that a public opinion, no matter how offensive, is not defamation. That's not just free speech. That's the Supreme Court. Her words were surgical, each sentence carved into the silence. Even the prosecution looked rattled, flipping through their notes as if hoping to find an escape route they didn't have. Monroe shifted in his chair, hand tightening on the gavel. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Not now. Not with the air charged and the gallery watching. Jasmine could see it in his eyes. He'd underestimated her. She drove the final nail with brutal clarity. Ferretta versus California, 1975. The right of a defendant to represent themselves in court is fundamental. It cannot be denied. Not by the prosecution, not by pressure, and not by a biased judge. The room froze. No one whispered. No one moved. Jasmine wasn't arguing anymore. She was declaring. And for the first time all morning, Monroe said nothing. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not with silence. Not with a judge like this. She had one more truth to unleash, and this one came with proof. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't posture. She simply reached into her binder with the calm precision of someone holding a weapon that didn't need to shout. Since we're questioning bias, she said evenly, I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence. She lifted a small digital recorder and pressed play. At first, just soft static, a chair scraping, then a voice, gravelly, familiar, unmistakable. Monroe's. A black woman at her age thinks she can teach me law? That's laughable. It was like someone had pulled the pin out of the courtroom. Gasps burst through the room like a wave breaking the walls. One juror's head jerked back. A clerk covered her mouth. A reporter stood up without realizing it. The gallery lit up in shocked murmurs, disbelief mixing with a crackling sense of something irreversible. It wasn't just offensive, it was nuclear, and it came from the very mouth that had been silencing Jasmine all morning. The reaction was instant. Pens dropped, cameras clicked, journalists whispered like the floor had turned to fire. Did he say that? Was that recorded in chambers? Oh my God! Monroe's jaw clenched. His gavel slammed once. Then again. Then again. 3 times, loud, frantic. Order! I said order in this courtroom! He shouted, eyes wide for the first time. But the sound of his voice, so confident hours ago, was now shaky, hollow. He wasn't commanding the room. He was begging it to return to him. Jasmine stood silently for another few seconds, letting the noise settle into dread. She knew exactly what she'd done, and she wasn't done yet. She turned her full focus to Monroe, her voice calm, her tone lethal. Under Section 455 of the United States Code, a judge must disqualify himself if his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. This isn't a question anymore. It's a fact. Monroe opened his mouth, but no sound came. His hands hovered over the bench like he didn't know what to do with them. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't blink. She delivered the final blow without raising her voice. I am formally requesting that you recuse yourself from this case due to demonstrated bias and judicial misconduct. Silence fell. Not the awkward kind, the kind that comes when truth hits too hard, too clean, too undeniable to refute. The court wasn't shocked anymore. It was stunned into stillness. The court didn't just hear the truth, they watched it explode. And when the dust settled, there was no choice left for Monroe but to step down. His face that morning was pale, but locked in fake composure, like a man clinging to dignity he'd already lost. He cleared his throat, glanced once at Jasmine, then looked away as if her presence burned. Due to recent developments, I am recusing myself from further proceedings in this case, Harn, he said flatly, eyes fixed on the wall. No remorse, no acknowledgement, just words, empty, forced, necessary. The room didn't clap, it didn't cheer, but it buzzed just beneath the surface. People exchanged silent looks like they'd witnessed something sacred. Accountability, rare and raw, finally made real. Monroe didn't wait for reaction. He turned, stepped down from the bench he once ruled like a throne, and disappeared through the back door without a single glance back. For all his gavel pounding and posturing, he left like a ghost, diminished and forgettable. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. But inside, a wall had cracked, and sunlight had started to come through. Then came the shift. A bailiff entered, brisk and focused, and announced the new presiding judge. The name hit the courtroom like thunder wrapped in order. Judge Margaret Ellis. People straightened in their seats. The press leaned in. This wasn't just a replacement. This was a new atmosphere being summoned. Ellis was legendary, not for dramatics, not for fame, but for her unshakable fairness and zero tolerance for bias. Her nickname among law clerks was the Scalpel, not because she cut people down, but because she cut directly to truth. She walked in without hesitation, her robe flowing behind her like a second spine. Her posture was firm but effortless, her eyes scanning the courtroom in a single controlled sweep. Jasmine met her gaze for just a moment, and what she saw wasn't warmth. It was structure, boundaries, precision, law. Ellis didn't smile. She didn't perform. She simply sat, adjusted her robe, and picked up the gavel as if it were never Monroe's to begin with. Then came her first words, calm and level but sharp enough to reset the room. This court is now in session, and let me be clear, we will proceed by the law, not by power, not by personality, but by the law alone. And with just that sentence, everything changed. The room seemed to settle, but not relax. It refocused, like a lens snapping back into clarity. No one dared whisper. No one dared look away. Monroe had used the bench like a weapon. Ellis used it like a scalpel. The trial hadn't gotten easier, but for the first time, justice felt possible. With Monroe gone and Judge Ellis now holding the gavel, the weight in the room shifted. Jasmine was no longer fighting for space. She was commanding it. The energy changed the moment Ellis nodded once and said, "Congresswoman Crockett, proceed with your evidence." No sarcasm, no pressure, just law. Jasmine didn't smile, but her silence spoke louder than any grin. She walked forward slowly, pulled a flash drive from her folder, and handed it to the court technician like it was the final bullet in a long, brutal war. The screen behind her lit up, the sound system clicking into place. "This is the unedited recording of the press conference in question," Jasmine said, her voice steady and firm. "From start to finish, time-stamped, public, verified." The video began to play, clear audio, wide shot, podium in frame. Jasmine stood calmly at the mic, answering questions with clarity and conviction. She never flinched. She never dodged. But more importantly, she never named Whoopi, not even once. At minute 7, Jasmine's voice rang out on the recording, crystal clear. "Some daytime programs have traded journalism for performance, and unfortunately, when entertainment starts dressing up as truth, it's the public that gets misled." There was no accusation, no insult, no name, just criticism directed at a pattern, not a person. The courtroom leaned in as the minutes ticked by. Ellis followed the footage line by line with a printed transcript in front of her, eyes sharp, pen unmoving. The prosecution grew still. Reporter stopped typing. The clip rolled on. Minute 8, then 9. Jasmine stood beside the screen like she was walking the room through a crime scene she didn't commit. She paused the video precisely at minute 9 and turned to the judge. "As the court can see, at no point in this entire press conference did I mention Ms. Goldberg by name. Not once." Silence hit like a closing vault. Even air felt heavier. Ellis looked up slowly from her transcript, then down again, cross-checking the line. No facial expression, just calculation. She didn't need to say a word. The courtroom already knew what it meant. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She'd exposed the truth beneath the noise. And she'd done it without shouting, without guessing, just facts. Facts that no gavel could strike down. But Jasmine didn't stop at proving what she didn't say. She came ready to prove that the house was already burning before anyone blamed her for lighting a match. She stepped forward once more, this time holding a thick, tabbed report like it was a case file for the entire network's unraveling. Her voice was calm, but there was iron underneath. "Let's talk about facts," she said, staring directly at the prosecution table. "Not opinions, not assumptions, just the numbers." She handed the report to the clerk, then turned toward the jury. "And you deserve to see them all." The screen flickered to life behind her, revealing a series of crisp, unforgiving graphs. The first was a weekly ratings chart labeled "The View Audience Decline, January through June." Jasmine didn't need to dramatize anything. The data spoke for itself. One line dipping lower and lower, like a heartbeat fading. "This is a 15-week trend," she explained, pointing with laser precision. "The ratings for The View have been falling steadily, long before I stepped up to a podium." She tapped a point on the graph dated March 12th. "In fact," she added, locking eyes with Judge Ellis, "the largest single-week drop came 3 weeks before I said a word." The room shifted. Jurors leaned in. Reporters scribbled faster. Even the prosecution team froze for a beat, flipping pages like they were hoping the truth could be edited in real time. But there it was. Cold, clean, undeniable. Jasmine let the silence stretch for just a breath before flipping to the next slide. Now came the deeper cut. Audience retention versus competing shows. The numbers were ruthless. Jasmine didn't blink. "Compared to other daytime programs in the same slot," she said slowly, "The View has been losing viewers at twice the rate since the start of the year." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The impact came from how flat the facts fell, like dominoes lined up by someone else, now collapsing in her favor. No tweets, no press conferences, just audience behavior. She took one final step back, then delivered her last line with surgical force. "So if we're going to talk about damage, let's not skip over what was already happening when I entered the conversation." And just like that, the oxygen changed. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She had carved the accusation open and shown the rot underneath. But Jasmine wasn't done dismantling the fantasy. After numbers came the noise, and she was ready to prove that noise isn't evidence. She turned to the screen and clicked to the next slide. Suddenly, the courtroom was filled with dozens of tweets, bold words, angry messages, insults flying across the screen. Jasmine stood in front of them like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "What you're seeing here," she said calmly, "are opinions, people's reactions, Fast thoughts typed online. Some were emotional, some were misinformed. But they're not facts. They're not proof. She pointed at one tweet that called her a disgrace. Then she looked at the jury. This tweet doesn't prove anything. It doesn't show that I mentioned Ms. Goldberg. It doesn't show that I had bad intentions. It just shows someone on the internet was mad. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was steady, strong, and clear. Social media outrage isn't truth, and it definitely isn't the law. Then she faced Judge Ellis directly. Her tone sharpened. None of these tweets prove I named Ms. Goldberg. None of them prove actual malice. They don't prove anything except that people online like to yell into the void. The courtroom was still. Even the prosecutor stayed quiet. She took a breath, then said the line that cut through the silence like a blade. Tweets are not facts, hashtags are not law, and retweets are not justice. No one needed to respond. Everyone in the room understood. Jasmine had just shown that the loudest voices online don't belong in a court of law. The facts had cut through the noise like lightning through fog, sharp, undeniable, and final. Now only one voice remained, the law itself. Judge Margaret Ellis sat still for a long moment, her fingers gently pressed together beneath her chin. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence so thick it could drown you. No shuffling papers, no whispers. Just tension, coiled and waiting. Jasmine stood calmly beside her table, her hands folded, her face unreadable. Her job was done. She had walked the room through the evidence piece by piece, stripped emotion away from speculation, and let the truth stand alone under the weight of logic and law. She didn't know what Ellis would say next, but she knew she had nothing left to prove. Ellis lowered her hands, looked up slowly, and then reached for the gavel, not to strike it, but simply to hold it. She glanced once at the jury, then back to the attorneys, and finally to Jasmine. Her tone was level, but the courtroom knew this was the moment everything would turn. This court, she began, has reviewed the presented evidence thoroughly. A single murmur stirred somewhere in the back, but was quickly silenced by the room's tension. Ellis continued, there has been much public noise surrounding this case, much speculation. But our responsibility here is not to react to outrage, nor to emotion, but to the Constitution and the precedent it sets. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the judge, calm but alert, holding steady as if preparing to catch the weight of history in real time. Ellis's voice remained measured. This court finds that the plaintiff has failed to meet the legal threshold for defamation. There was a subtle shift in the room, shoulders straightening, a held breath released. There is no evidence, Ellis said clearly, of actual malice. The moment the word malice left her mouth, a ripple passed through the audience. Jasmine's legal team exchanged glances. The prosecution sat frozen. Ellis didn't slow down. And therefore, there is no case. The final strike landed with the quiet force of a falling verdict. The claim is dismissed. For a full second, the room didn't move. No one clapped, no one gasped. It was the kind of silence that comes only after battle, the kind of silence that dares you to believe you heard what you just heard. Then, an eruption. Not chaos, applause. Loud, genuine, unapologetic applause. People stood up, some with their hands high, some with quiet tears. Others just nodded slowly, as if finally something sacred had been restored. Even members of the press, long trained to remain impartial, lowered their cameras for a moment, just long enough to clap with one hand. Judge Ellis didn't react. She simply raised the gavel and tapped once. The applause dimmed, but didn't die. It couldn't. Not yet. Jasmine stood still as the courtroom around her came to life. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her arms like a politician on election night. She just breathed, one long, full breath. And in that breath was release. Not relief, release. As if the weight of every insult, every interruption, every slanderous tweet and sideways glare had finally cracked and fallen off her back. She didn't win by shouting louder. She won by refusing to shrink. She had been called too bold, too angry, too loud, too dangerous. But today she had been called something else. Right. And for everyone watching, inside that courtroom, behind those cameras, or replaying the live stream from the quiet corners of America, it meant something more. It meant that the system didn't win this time. The system blinked. And one woman, unapologetically black, unapologetically smart, unapologetically unbought, had stood her ground and reminded them all that justice doesn't come easy, but it can come. Someone in the gallery whispered, "She did it." Another voice followed. "She didn't just defend herself. She defended all of us." And they weren't wrong. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just walked into that courtroom to save her name. She walked in to make a point that couldn't be buried by spin or sealed behind bias. She had come armed with truth, with law, with fire in her spine. And she had walked out with something bigger than a dismissal. She had walked out a symbol of what it looks like when you don't back down, when you take the hits, when you stare down power in a robe, in a suit, in a system, and don't flinch. She didn't say a word as she gathered her notes. She didn't need to. The crowd's reaction spoke for her. Some were crying, some were just staring, but all were changed. And in that room, one truth now stood taller than any accusation. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win. She became unstoppable. But for Jasmine, the courtroom was never the destination. It was merely the ignition point, an undeniable spark that lit a fuse running deep beneath the marble floors of the Capitol. The verdict had vindicated her, yes, but that wasn't enough, not even close. "One ruling doesn't fix a broken system," she told the cameras that waited for her just outside the courthouse. "It just proves that even a broken system can't silence a prepared woman forever." Less than 72 hours later, Jasmine returned to Congress, not as a victorious plaintiff, but as a determined legislator. Her tone had sharpened, her stride was firmer, and in her hand was a 3-page resolution that would send shockwaves through the judiciary. The bill was simple in title but seismic in effect: the Independent Judicial Oversight Commission Act, a watchdog entity with full investigatory power, subpoena authority, and a public-facing mandate to hold federal judges accountable. No more self-policing, no more robes hiding rot. "They judge us every day," Jasmine declared as she introduced the bill on the House floor, her voice echoing with restrained fire. "It's about time someone judged them." The room wasn't ready. Some lawmakers blinked. Others leaned back, arms crossed. A few sneered behind tight smiles. But Jasmine didn't come to read the room. She came to redraw its lines. Her proposal demanded a nonpartisan oversight committee made up of legal scholars, retired judges, civil rights advocates, and public defenders. Not hand-picked elites, not political cronies. Voices from the trenches. Voices the judiciary had ignored for far too long. Next, she doubled down with a second measure: mandatory anti-bias certification for every federal judge, clerk, bailiff, and court officer in the system. Not optional, not symbolic, required, recurring, and enforceable by law. Training modules would focus on racial bias, gender discrimination, socioeconomic prejudice, and historic injustice. "The courtroom is the last place bias should live," Jasmine said at a press conference, "but for too long it's been hiding in plain sight." She paused before adding, "If I wasn't in that courtroom last week, they would have buried the truth under 1,000 polished words. So I'm done waiting. Let's legislate." The media exploded. Headlines split down the middle. One side hailed Jasmine as the boldest reform voice since the Church Committee. The other accused her of waging war on the judicial branch. Within hours, conservative commentators called her a radical in heels, a vengeful disruptor, and in one particularly venomous op-ed, a disgrace to congressional decorum. But Jasmine didn't blink. On the House floor, as members tried to reframe her effort as personal retaliation, she stood steady, head high. "If fairness in court is partisan to you," she said, locking eyes with a senior Republican from Texas, "then maybe you're not afraid of politics. Maybe you're afraid of fairness." That sentence landed like a body blow. A low murmur spread across the chamber. Some clapped quietly. Others turned away, ashamed to meet her gaze. She didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. But she cut deeper than any insult could reach, with the calm precision of someone who had seen the belly of the beast and walked out holding evidence. Backlash came quickly. Several conservative senators held an emergency press briefing, accusing Jasmine of weaponizing a court victory to sow distrust. One representative claimed she was grandstanding off of daytime drama. Another said her proposals would make judges second-guess the law. Jasmine, and when asked about it by reporters, offered only one line. Good. Maybe the law could use a little more second-guessing. Still, resistance wasn't just political, it was institutional. Judicial lobbying groups began quietly circulating memos, warning that her reforms would undermine public trust in courts. Federal judges released a rare joint statement urging Congress to refrain from political encroachment. But while they scrambled behind closed doors, Jasmine went straight to the public. She launched a national speaking tour called Beyond the Bench, appearing in universities, law schools, community centers, and online town halls. She didn't bring a legal team. She didn't read from notes. She spoke from scars. They told me the system was fair, she said at Howard University, until it put me on trial for telling the truth. At UCLA, she addressed future lawyers directly. Don't you dare walk into that courtroom thinking the robe makes someone holy. Ask questions, demand answers, and if a system built to protect justice tries to silence you, burn louder. And America listened. Legal scholars published op-eds in her favor. Retired judges cautiously endorsed the need for oversight. Civil rights groups flooded Congress with letters of support. Hashtags trended. Law students rallied. Mothers wrote in. A viral clip of Jasmine saying they judge us. It's time we judge them. Hit 27 million views in under 48 hours. Even members of Congress who once rolled their eyes began shifting uncomfortably. A Republican senator from Georgia quietly pulled his name off an opposing bill. A Democrat from Delaware who had remained neutral publicly endorsed Jasmine's anti-bias certification proposal, citing overwhelming support from the public and the legal community. Under pressure, the House Judiciary Committee scheduled a hearing on her proposals. Jasmine walked into the chamber, flanked by legal experts, constitutional scholars, and former public defenders. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just opened with one truth. This bill doesn't punish judges. It protects the people they serve. By the end of the hearing, 3 swing vote members had signaled support. The momentum had shifted, not fully, not finally, but undeniably. Jasmine Crockett, once seen as a long-shot plaintiff in a courtroom fight no one expected her to win, was now writing the next chapter of judicial reform in America. And this time, the gavel wasn't in the judge's hand. It was in hers. But real victory doesn't echo in applause. It reveals itself in the silence that follows, when those who once denied the truth finally sit down to learn from it. The training room inside the federal judicial building was nothing like a courtroom. No benches, no flags, no elevated platforms to distinguish power from humility. Just a rectangular space, lined with steel chairs and cold fluorescent lighting. And yet, for those who gathered that morning, dozens of sitting judges, legal clerks, federal ethics officers, something about the air felt heavier than any verdict they'd ever delivered. Because this wasn't routine. This wasn't protocol. This was a reckoning. No one expected Judge Richard Monroe to appear. Not after what happened. Not after the headlines. Not after his name became synonymous with the old guard of judicial impunity. But as the door opened and he stepped in, no robe, no entourage, just a plain gray suit and a folder clutched tightly in his hands, every head turned. Conversations stopped. Pens paused mid-sentence. The arrogance that once followed him into every room had been stripped away. What remained was something rare in the justice system, a man willing to face the echo of his own authority. He didn't speak at first, he didn't need to. His presence was the admission. The workshop began with a simple question projected on screen. Can a judge be fair if they believe they already are? Most in the room avoided eye contact. A few scribbled notes. But Monroe, who used to silence dissent with a glance, was now listening with a stillness that felt almost fragile. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in the back, arms crossed, watching. She wasn't there as a politician today. She was there as a witness to what truth, when delivered without apology, could force even the most rigid systems to confront. Midway through the session, the speaker opened the floor, and that's when Monroe stood. He didn't preface, Didn't clear his throat. He just spoke. My biggest mistake wasn't in how I ruled. It was in thinking I was immune to bias. Gas didn't erupt. No phones buzzed. But the silence that followed cut like a blade. Even the facilitator froze. Monroe's words didn't land like a confession. They hit like a detonator. He continued, voice steady but stripped of pride. I owe you an apology, Congresswoman Crockett. Not just for that courtroom, but for every time I believed silence was neutrality. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but her presence, calm and immovable, felt seismic. She didn't stand, didn't nod, just let the weight of those words settle where they belonged, inside a system built on deference, finally cracked open from within. The room didn't applaud. This wasn't theater. It was transformation. One man admitting he had worn the robe like armor and mistaken comfort for justice, and now in front of peers who once whispered behind closed doors, he was surrendering to accountability, not forced, not coerced, but conscious. By the end of the session, a memo circulated quietly among attendees. It contained the newly ratified Federal Judicial Anti-Bias Initiative, modeled directly on Jasmine's proposed reforms. The components were bold: mandatory anti-bias training every 2 years, an independent oversight committee with subpoena power, and annual public disclosures of ethical compliance. It was everything they'd once laughed off as political theater. Now it was law. News didn't break immediately, but the legal community noticed. California Supreme Court Chief Justice Elena Morales publicly praised the initiative within 48 hours. In a surprise announcement, the California Judicial Council passed a motion to replicate the program statewide. Bias, Morales declared, isn't just a flaw. It's a disease we've normalized. And now finally we're treating it. In Texas, the shift was more dramatic. Long considered resistant to federal intervention, the Lone Star State did the unthinkable. At a bipartisan press conference in Austin, a Republican senator stood beside a Democratic House representative and introduced the Judicial Transparency and Ethics Act of Texas. Cameras rolled as the senator looked into the lens and said, "If this happened to her, imagine what we've missed in courts without microphones." Journalists were stunned. Texas, often the epicenter of judicial conservatism, was leading reform. But this wasn't about red or blue anymore. It was about what Jasmine had exposed in real time. That justice, when wielded without self-awareness, becomes theater. And when unchecked, it becomes weaponized. Other states followed like dominoes. Illinois, New Jersey, Colorado, Massachusetts. Each one convened emergency task forces. University law schools began redesigning ethics curriculum around Jasmine's testimony. Harvard Law School made her cross-examination of Monroe required viewing for first-year students. Yale issued an open letter endorsing her reforms. Georgetown launched a series called Bias in the Bench: Lessons from the Crockett Case. Monroe's admission was no longer a personal apology. It became a precedent. Back in Washington, Jasmine received an invitation to speak at the annual Judicial Ethics Summit. She declined, not out of bitterness, but because the message had already landed where it needed to. Instead, she sent a single quote to be read at the opening session. "I wasn't there to break the court. I was there to make it see." Inside that original training room, Monroe remained after others had left. He walked slowly to where Jasmine had sat, her chair still slightly turned. For a long time, he just stood there, silent. Then he placed his folder down. Inside were handwritten notes from the session, circled passages from Crockett's hearing, and one yellow post-it stuck to the cover that read, "Blind justice can't start with blind judges." Across the country, something was shifting, not with noise, but with intent. It wasn't about Jasmine versus Monroe anymore. It was about a system realizing that silence was no longer an option. And Monroe, once the symbol of that silence, had become something unexpected. A mirror. But mirrors don't just reflect others. They force you to see yourself. And as the nation stared into the face of its justice system, one figure stood unmistakably in the frame: Jasmine Crockett. The invitation from Yale Law School didn't come with fireworks, no cameras, no headlines, just a letter, hand-signed by the dean, tucked inside an ivory envelope. "We invite you," it read, to deliver the keynote address for our National Symposium on Justice. The theme, Justice Without Bias. Jasmine held the envelope in her hands for a long moment, silent. After everything, the hearings, the shouting, the breaking, someone still believed she should speak. She didn't say yes immediately. In fact, she almost threw it away. Part of her wondered if it was a trap, a symbolic olive branch meant to tame her edge. But then she thought of Monroe's face as she spoke those words. Blind justice can't start with blind judges. She thought of the letters piling up in her office, from strangers with stories that mirrored her own. And she realized this wasn't about her ego. It was about momentum. If she stopped now, silence would return. And silence was the enemy. The day she arrived in New Haven, the air buzzed with a kind of silent urgency. Students flooded into the Yale auditorium hours early, lining up in the cold just to get inside. The room could hold 700, but over 2,000 showed up. They packed the aisles, sat on the floors, stood on the steps. It wasn't about Ivy League formality anymore. It was about truth, and they came to see the woman who shattered it open. When Jasmine stepped onto that stage, there was no mistaking the atmosphere. It was not applause. It was a rupture. A roar that didn't come from respect alone, but from relief. Relief that someone had finally named what everyone else danced around. She approached the podium with quiet control. No flashy clothes, no entourage. Just a black blazer, a manila folder, and a presence that made the room lean forward. Her first words cut like steel through velvet. If justice only serves the powerful, then what you're defending isn't justice, it's control. The air snapped. Students stopped breathing. Some began to type. Others simply watched, stunned. Jasmine didn't rush. She walked the room through a minefield of truth, calm, precise, devastating. She didn't offer policy points. She offered pressure. Stories of men imprisoned without trials. Women whose silence was bought with threats. Judges who saw skin color before evidence. She paused, looked around, and said, if you're not willing to piss off the system, then you're not trying hard enough to fix it. What happened next didn't feel like a speech. It felt like a reckoning. Across campuses, students started streaming it live. Law professors who had once dismissed her as too emotional sat frozen in their seats. Alumni texted each other mid-sentence. She just shifted the room. Jasmine spoke for 38 minutes. Not once did she raise her voice. Not once did she apologize. She simply laid out a challenge. Stop hiding behind tradition and start defending justice that defends everyone. Justice doesn't come from robes. It comes from resistance. The next day, headlines couldn't keep up. CNN, Crockett ignites Yale. Washington Post, the doctrine of bias is broken. Teen Vogue, we just found our next RBG. But Jasmine didn't care about the press. What stopped her heart were the letters. Hundreds of them. They came by mail, email, even tucked under her hotel door. Some were neat and formal. Others were messy, tear-stained, or typed with trembling fingers. One from a man in Ohio read, I spent 14 years behind bars for a robbery I didn't commit. My appeal got tossed with 3 sentences. I watched your speech on a prison TV, and I cried, not because you spoke about me, but because you made me believe someone still sees me. A college student wrote, I used to think justice was about rules. Now I think it's about courage. I'm changing my major to law because of you. A young mother from Alabama. I saw your clip while feeding my baby. I don't know anything about politics, but you said something no one ever did. That silence is a choice. Thank you, Jasmine read every word. But even as her inbox overflowed with praise, the shadows weren't quiet for long. The backlash came swift and calculated. One conservative outlet called her an egotistical provocateur. A right-wing senator tweeted, Crockett's speech at Yale was the most dangerous 38 minutes of legal demagoguery in modern memory. Think tanks wrote entire rebuttals framing her as a media-made figurehead who undermines the legitimacy of our institutions. The knives were out, not because she lied, but because she told the truth too clearly. Political groups began circulating clips from the speech, sliced out of context to make her look radical. One PAC ran an ad calling her the chaos candidate in a black robe. Others tried to paint her as a fame-hungry opportunist. "She doesn't want justice," one radio host growled. "She wants stardom." But the more they attacked, the more the debate grew. A national conversation erupted. Can young outsider voices truly shape the future of justice? On talk shows, old guard judges debated fresh-faced law students. Town halls saw generational lines drawn not by age but by trust. One caller said, "She speaks truth, but the system isn't ready for her." Another snapped back, "Then maybe it's the system that should leave." Every night, news anchors ran panels arguing whether Jasmine Crockett was a danger or a necessity. But inside the chaos, something rare happened. Even those who hated her respected her. The moment that summed it all came on live television. A morning news show brought in a special guest to comment on Jasmine's speech, Whoopi Goldberg. The host, expecting heat, leaned in and asked, "So, what do you think of Jasmine Crockett?" Whoopi didn't blink. "I don't like her," she said flatly, "but I respect her mind, and I respect her guts." The studio went silent, then exploded. It wasn't praise. It wasn't love. It was something more powerful, reluctant reverence. And that, Jasmine knew, was more valuable than applause. Because when your opponent respects you, it means they can no longer ignore you. Back in D.C., Jasmine didn't hold press conferences. She didn't post photos. She went home, kicked off her heels, and sat in silence. The fight wasn't over. It had just evolved. On her desk sat a shoebox full of handwritten letters. She pulled one out. It was written by a retired judge from Montana. "We didn't all close our eyes, but we stayed quiet. Thank you for making silence shameful." She folded it carefully and whispered, "One mirror at a time." Because in the end, Jasmine wasn't chasing justice like a dream. She was forcing it to look back at itself and decide if it still liked what it saw. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. Because behind every headline, behind every standing ovation, there were still courtrooms where decisions were made in silence, where bias wore a black robe and justice showed up late, if at all. For every judge like Monroe who blinked at the mirror, there were 10 more who hadn't even looked. If the system was beginning to wake up, then someone had to keep shaking it. And Jasmine had no intention of letting it fall back asleep. Justice doesn't come when it's convenient. It doesn't arrive after a vote or a press release. It comes when someone forces it to. Jasmine knew this better than anyone. She'd seen what happened when people waited too long, when truth knocked, but nobody opened the door. Justice doesn't self-invite. It needs someone who knows the rules, and someone willing to break the silence that protects them. That's why Jasmine stood where few dared to. Not because she craved the spotlight, but because someone had to say what others were too afraid to. She understood what the law could do, but also what it refused to do unless someone demanded it. Justice doesn't appear on its own. It needs those who understand the law and have the courage to stand up. That was more than a statement. It was a warning, a challenge, a battle cry disguised as truth. She spoke it in courtrooms. She repeated it in classrooms. She whispered it to those too battered by the system to raise their voices. No matter who you are, senator or citizen, evidence and courage are what make you heard. In her voice, it wasn't just philosophy, it was strategy. A blueprint for those who had nothing left but the truth and the audacity to speak it out loud. Jasmine knew that law alone didn't shift history. That took people, ordinary people. People like Mr. Alvarez, who spent 13 years in prison for a crime a fingerprint could have cleared. People like Maya from Chicago, whose landlord silenced her complaints until she read the housing code out loud on Facebook Live. They weren't lawyers. They weren't rich. But they knew enough to fight, and once they started fighting, the system couldn't keep pretending it didn't hear them. The flood of letters came quietly at first, handwritten notes from strangers who had never seen a courtroom, but felt every word she spoke. Then came the files, court transcripts, old verdicts, evidence buried for decades. "I thought no one would believe me," one woman wrote. "Then I saw you." These weren't just thank yous. They were torches being passed, from those who suffered to the one who finally said, "You're not invisible." And still the backlash came. Loud, nasty, brutal. Political groups labeled her a threat to judicial neutrality. Others called her a star chaser, arrogant, dangerously ambitious. Pundits on talk shows asked, "Who does she think she is?" But Jasmine didn't blink, because every time they attacked her tone, it meant they couldn't argue with her facts. Every insult thrown at her was just confirmation. She had hit a nerve they weren't ready to expose. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. It became a question every generation had to face. Do the young have a place in defining justice? Were the people who inherited the broken system also allowed to fix it? The debate raged on television, in classrooms, on street corners and subcommittees. One congressman sneered, "She's 20 years too early." But a law student replied online, "No, she's 40 years too late." Still, even critics began to shift. Not because they agreed, but because they could no longer deny her impact. One by one, the walls started to talk. And perhaps the most honest voice came from someone who never once pretended to like her. Whoopi, sharp as ever, didn't sugarcoat it. "I don't like her, but I respect her mind and her guts." That was Jasmine's victory. Not applause, but acknowledgement from those who wanted her gone. She knew respect meant more when it came from opposition. When someone who couldn't stand you still admitted, "You were right." It wasn't about changing their minds. It was about changing what they couldn't unsee. Because once justice has a face, it can't be ignored anymore. And Jasmine had become that face, whether they cheered her or cursed her. She walked into hearings with case law like ammunition. She didn't waste time on niceties. She dissected legal loopholes with surgical calm and interrupted silence with proof, not passion. That's what shook them. Not noise, but strategy. Not anger, but precision. That's what made her unstoppable, because no one could call her emotional when she brought the entire statute with her. But Jasmine always knew this wasn't about her. Not really. A courtroom victory means nothing if it only clears a name. It must clear a path. Mok kwok chien fap li than kong hong chi mang lai chien, than kan han, ma kong ko da thai, joy kan hi thong. That's why she kept fighting after the cameras were gone. That's why she showed up to hearings nobody televised. Because justice wasn't a performance. It was a commitment. And commitment meant pressure. The kind that crushed careers and strained friendships. Colleagues distanced themselves. Lobbyists pulled support. Her own team asked if she wanted to slow down. She didn't. "If we stop now," she told them, "we teach the system it can wait us out." She understood something most politicians forget. Winning the argument doesn't matter if you lose the momentum. She had to keep going before the next Monroe put his robe back on like nothing happened. Every time she stood up in that chamber, she remembered the faces of those who couldn't. Every time she walked into a courtroom, she remembered who never walked out. And every time she spoke for people whose names would never make the news. That's why her words cut deeper. That's why her voice carried. Because Jasmine Crockett never wanted to be remembered for volume. She wanted to be remembered for impact. She didn't care if they called her radical, reckless, loud, emotional, or arrogant. She only cared if they listened. Because the moment they listen, even for a second, that's when the lie begins to die. That's when the illusion cracks. That's when real justice has a chance to breathe. In her final Yale Law address, the room fell silent not because of applause, but because of truth. No slogan, no theatrics, just one sentence delivered like a gavel to the gut. And in that moment, it didn't matter who agreed or disagreed. It didn't matter what party you came from. It didn't matter how much power you had. The only thing that mattered was what you chose to do after hearing it. Jasmine stood still, her voice steady, her gaze direct. And she said, "If you stay silent, bias lives. But if you stand up, justice lives." And the room didn't erupt. It froze. Because they all knew, whether they liked it or not, that she was right. And justice had just been given a heartbeat. And when the echoes of her final words faded, something shifted. Not just in the courtroom, not just in Congress, but in the hearts of those watching. Because that kind of truth doesn't just sit in the air. It travels. It latches onto those who hear it and refuses to let go. And that's where the real story begins. Not with what Jasmine said, but with what we choose to do after we've heard it. This isn't a movie. There's no background music swelling as justice triumphs. No slow fade to black. Real life is messier than that. It's people working double shifts, getting denied for apartments, being pulled over for no reason, watching someone with half their qualifications get promoted. It's the quiet unfairness that builds until you either explode or stay silent forever. But silence isn't safety. It's surrender. You don't have to be Jasmine Crockett to fight back. You don't need a podium or a press badge. What you need is what she had when she first started. Eyes that refuse to look away and a voice that refused to shrink. If someone at your job is being mistreated, speak up, even if it's uncomfortable. If your school's policies hurt the ones with the least, challenge them. You don't need a law degree to recognize injustice. You need courage. Just a little. Enough to take one step. Because the truth is, most systems are built to count on your silence. They rely on your exhaustion, your fear, your feeling of being too small to matter. But that's the lie. Jasmine wasn't powerful when she started. She became powerful when she refused to back down. And so can you. In the meeting, in the courtroom, in the classroom, at your kitchen table. Power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it shows up in sneakers with receipts and a question. Why? Let's talk about action. You want to change something? Start local. Show up to your city council meeting, even if you don't understand all the jargon. Ask who's funding your school board candidates. Look into who owns the land your neighbors are being pushed off of. If you find something that stinks, don't just complain. Document it, share it, connect with others who care. Jasmine didn't wait for permission to speak. She gave herself permission. So should you. If you're a teacher, teach your students how laws are made and who they were originally made for. If you're a nurse, ask why certain zip codes have worse outcomes. If you're a delivery driver, notice which neighborhoods get complaints and which don't. If you've been arrested, sued, ignored, denied, erased, don't let that silence you. Let it sharpen you, because your story might be the evidence someone else needs to wake up. Maybe you're thinking, but I'm tired. I've got enough to deal with. That's real and fair. But remember this, Jasmine stood up while she was tired, while being attacked, while knowing the cost. You don't need to carry the whole system. You just need to push where you stand. And if enough of us push, the weight starts to shift. The cracks grow. The silence breaks. Talk to your kids about justice, not as a dream, but as a decision. Let them see you challenge something. Let them hear you say, that's not right, and mean it. Let them grow up knowing that law and morality don't always match, and that we get to close that gap, one action at a time, one uncomfortable truth at a time, one moment of bravery that someone else will never forget. And if someone tells you to sit down, ask them why they're so afraid of your voice. If someone says it's always been this way, ask them who it served. If they call you emotional, let them. Because emotion is what injustice fears most. It's what makes people act. Logic convinces, but emotion moves. That's why they want you quiet. That's why they want you polite. Don't give them that comfort. Are you a student? Ask your school what books are banned and who decided that. Are you a parent? Demand transparency in the scholarships, zoning, and resources given to your child's school. Are you unemployed? You still have power. Your vote, your voice, your refusal to be erased. Are you undocumented? You are not invisible. There are groups fighting for your rights every day, and they need your story. And if you're someone who's never experienced injustice directly, don't just be an ally. Be an amplifier. Use your privilege like a crowbar, not to protect comfort, but to pry open doors. Don't just post a quote and move on. Ask yourself, what am I protecting by staying neutral? What could I risk if I stood up? Jasmine's story isn't a fairy tale. It's a blueprint, a reminder that change doesn't trickle down. It pushes up from people who refuse to be shut out. She didn't just expose a judge. She exposed a system, and she reminded all of us that even the highest walls crack when enough hands push against them. So here's the truth. You don't need to be famous to be fearless. You don't need a badge to ask a hard question. You don't need a stage to demand better. You just need to care enough to act, and to act even when no one thanks you, even when it costs you. Because justice doesn't reward convenience, it rewards courage. Remember this: if you stay silent, bias lives. But if you stand up, justice lives. So what will you choose? Because the system is watching. And more importantly, so are the people who've been waiting their whole lives for someone like you to speak. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.